I still remember the morning I realized my own neighborhood association had sold something that never belonged to them. And the strangest part was that they did it with the confidence of people who truly believed nobody would ever challenge them. They had already promised my private lake to a luxury developer. They had already celebrated the deal in their community newsletter, and they had no idea that within a few days that same lake would be nothing but cracked mud before their buyers arrived. My name is Daniel Harper, and this is the story of how a group of people who thought they controlled everything learned the hard way that paperwork still matters more than ego. I live on a quiet piece of land about 40 minutes outside Asheville, North Carolina, where my family owns a little over 7 wooded acres surrounded by old oak trees and rolling hills. At the center of that property sits a small spring-fed lake that has been part of my family's life for nearly 70 years. My grandfather, Walter, built that lake back in 1958 after buying an old piece of farming equipment from a neighbor and spending months digging out the basin himself. He wasn't a wealthy man. He wasn't some famous builder. He was just a stubborn old farmer who believed that if you worked hard enough, you could create something that would outlast you. And somehow he was right. Growing up, that lake was where my dad taught me how to fish, where I spent summer afternoons skipping rocks, and where I eventually brought my own kids when they were young. It wasn't some fancy neighborhood amenity with a little sign and a membership fee. It was family. It was history. It was the kind of place where you could sit quietly with a cup of coffee in your hand and forget that the rest of the world existed. For years, my morning routine never changed. I'd walk down the old wooden path behind my house, watch the fog lift off the water, clear a few leaves from the surface, and just stand there for a few minutes, listening to nothing but birds and the wind moving through the trees. Then one cold afternoon in early April, everything changed. I was walking near the shoreline when I noticed something bright orange stuck into the ground. At first, I thought it was some leftover marker from a utility crew, but when I walked closer, I saw a small survey tag attached to it. It read Lot 7B Expansion Area, Future Recreation Development. I remember standing there for a full minute trying to convince myself I was reading it wrong. A few days later, I received the Neighborhood Association newsletter, and that's when my stomach dropped. The board had announced what they called a major community improvement project. They proudly explained that they had reached an agreement with a real estate company called Blue Ridge Haven Development to transform the lake area into a private recreational attraction for a new collection of luxury cabins. They talked about increased property values, new amenities, and how everyone in the neighborhood would benefit. Everyone except me, apparently, because the lake they were talking about wasn't theirs. It was mine. The first thing I did was check my property records because, honestly, part of me thought maybe I had somehow misunderstood something. Maybe there was some old agreement my grandfather signed decades ago. Maybe there was some hidden clause that gave the association rights I didn't know about. But when I opened the county records, I found exactly what I expected. The lake was completely inside my property boundaries. The deed went back decades, and there were no shared access agreements, no community rights, no restrictions, nothing that gave the association any authority over my land. I wasn't angry at first. I was confused. How could a group of people make $1 million deal involving property they didn't own? That question stayed in my head all night. The next week, I decided to attend the association meeting and ask directly. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted an explanation. But when I walked into that room and saw the board sitting at the front table, I immediately knew this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. At the center was the association president, Meredith Caldwell, a woman in her late 50s who always dressed like she was heading to a business meeting even when she was just handing out parking notices. She had a reputation for being organized, confident, and, according to some neighbors, a little too comfortable telling other people what they could and couldn't do. I waited until the meeting ended, then approached her with the documents in my hand. I said, "Meredith, can we talk about the lake project?" She smiled like she had already won an argument I hadn't even started. She said, "Daniel, I was actually hoping you would come around. This is going to be great for everyone." I looked at her and asked the only question that mattered. Great for everyone except the person who owns the lake? Her smile disappeared for just a second. Then she leaned back and said, "The association has always treated that water as a community resource." I told her, one voice, "Treating something like yours doesn't make it yours." She gave a small laugh and said, "You need to understand, sometimes the community has to make decisions for the greater good." That sentence bothered me more than anything else she said, because I had heard it before. It was the kind of phrase people use when they want power without responsibility. I walked out of that meeting frustrated. But I wasn't defeated. I went home, opened the old filing cabinet in my office, and started searching through decades of paperwork my grandfather had left behind. And somewhere inside those dusty folders was something Meredith and the board never knew existed, a document that would completely change the balance of power between us. I spent the next few hours sitting on the floor of my office, surrounded by old folders, faded envelopes, and documents that smelled like dust and time. My wife, Karen, walked by the doorway and just stared at the mess. She asked, "Daniel, are you looking for something specific? Or did you finally decide to organize your office by throwing everything onto the floor?" I laughed because, honestly, that was exactly what it looked like. But underneath all that paper was something important, something that had been sitting there for decades, waiting for the right moment. Around midnight, I found a folder with my grandfather's handwriting on it. Inside were old property maps, county approvals, and a drainage agreement that I had never paid much attention to before. At first, I thought it was just another piece of history, but then I started reading carefully. The document showed that my grandfather had not only built the lake legally, but he had also secured full control over the water management system connected to it. Years earlier, when heavy storms caused flooding issues in the area, the county had approved a drainage easement that allowed my family to control the lake's outflow for maintenance and flood prevention. In simple terms, the water was on my land, and the decisions about managing that water belonged to me. I kept reading, and the more I learned, the more unbelievable it became. The association wasn't just mistaken. They had never checked. They had never reviewed the deed. They had never contacted me. They simply assumed that because something was visible from the neighborhood, it belonged to the neighborhood. And that assumption was about to cost them everything. The next morning, I called a local property attorney named Rebecca Sloan, someone who had handled land disputes in the county for more than 20 years. I didn't call her because I wanted to fight. I called because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly where I stood. She came by that afternoon, walked the property lines, reviewed the documents, and after almost an hour of silence, she looked up and said, "Daniel, I have to tell you something. I've seen a lot of HOA disputes in my career, but this one is different. They didn't just overstep. They built an entire business deal on land they had no legal authority to promise." I asked her what my options were. She gave me several, including sending a formal warning, stopping the development process, or filing an immediate legal action. But then she said something that made me think. She said, "Before you decide what to do, ask yourself one question. What outcome do you actually want?" And that question stayed with me, because the truth was, I wasn't interested in destroying anyone. I didn't want my neighbors to suffer. I didn't want people losing their homes or their investments because a few board members made a mistake. But I also couldn't ignore what happened. Meredith and the board weren't treating me like a neighbor. They were treating me like an obstacle. They believed they could simply take control of something because they had a title and a meeting room. So I decided I wasn't going to argue with them. I was going to let reality speak for itself. The following week, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, Meredith was standing in front of the room celebrating the development deal. She had pictures of the planned luxury cabins on a projector screen. She talked about the future, about growth, about how everyone would thank the board someday. I sat in the back quietly listening. Then she noticed me and smiled. "Daniel," she said, "I'm glad you came. I hope you've reconsidered your position." I stood up and placed a copy of my deed on the table. I said, "Actually, Meredith, I brought something you might want to read." She barely looked at it. She said, "We've already reviewed everything necessary." I looked around the room and asked, "Did the board review the actual property deed?" The room went quiet. Nobody answered. Then I asked, "Did anyone verify ownership before signing a development agreement?" Still nothing. Meredith crossed her arms and said, "Daniel, this isn't the time for theatrics." I smiled because that word told me everything I needed to know. To her, the truth was a performance. Documentation was drama. Facts were an inconvenience. I said, "Meredith, I'm not creating a problem. I'm showing you the problem that already existed." A few neighbors started whispering. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked angry, because many of them had been told the project was completely legitimate. They had voted based on information the board gave them, not the information the board failed to find. Meredith ended the meeting early, but I could tell something had changed. The confidence she walked in with was gone. 2 days later, I received a letter from the developer's attorney asking to discuss the situation. They had finally discovered the ownership issue. They weren't angry at me. They were angry that the HOA had represented something they didn't legally control. The developer had already spent money preparing plans, surveys, and engineering reports based on the assumption that the lake would be available. The entire project was built on one simple mistake. They trusted the wrong people. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to stop the lake from existing. I wasn't going to damage the environment. I wasn't going to do anything outside the law. But I was going to exercise the rights that my family had legally owned for generations. I contacted the county, confirmed my maintenance rights, and scheduled a controlled seasonal water drawdown, something the existing permits allowed for lake maintenance. When Meredith heard what I was doing, she called me immediately. Her voice wasn't calm anymore. She said, "Daniel, you can't just drain that lake." I replied, "That's interesting, because a few weeks ago you said it wasn't mine." She went silent. Then she said, "This could hurt everyone." I told her, "Meredith, this wouldn't be happening if everyone had checked who owned it before selling it." The next morning, the pump arrived. It sat near the southern drainage point, exactly where my grandfather had designed the system decades earlier. I remember standing there watching the first drops of water move through the pipe. It wasn't dramatic. There was no big movie moment, just the sound of water leaving a place that had held my family's memories for generations. But emotionally, it felt heavier than that. It felt like watching someone finally realize they had pushed the wrong person too far. For 6 days, the system ran under careful supervision. Slowly, the water level dropped. The reflection of the trees disappeared inch by inch. The lake that everyone suddenly wanted to control was becoming something they couldn't sell anymore. And while the HOA board scrambled behind the scenes, trying to explain what happened to the developer, I just waited. Because I knew the real test wasn't whether they understood the paperwork. The real test was what they would do when the people they fooled finally started asking questions. The morning the developers arrived for their final inspection is something I still remember clearly, not because I was celebrating, but because I finally saw the moment when confidence turned into confusion. For weeks, the HOA board had walked around like nothing could touch them. They had meetings, presentations, expensive brochures, and polished speeches about progress and opportunity. They talked about the lake as if it was already a product sitting on a shelf waiting to be sold. But that morning, when those black SUVs rolled down the gravel road toward my property, the reality they had been ignoring was waiting for them. I stood near my back porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching from a distance. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't trying to create some dramatic scene. I just wanted to see the expression on people's faces when they finally understood what I had been saying all along. The first person out of the vehicle was a man named Travis Bennett, the project manager from Blue Ridge Haven Development. I had met him once before during the early stages of the dispute, and honestly, he seemed like a decent person. He wasn't the enemy. He was just someone who had trusted the wrong people. He walked toward the lake carrying a folder filled with plans and photographs. Behind him were 2 engineers and a woman from the investment group who kept talk about timelines, construction phases, and projected returns. They were already discussing numbers before they even reached the shoreline. They weren't seeing a place where my grandfather spent years working with his own hands. They were seeing cabins, rental income, and profit margins. Then they reached the edge of the water, and they stopped. There was a silence that lasted longer than I expected. The woman holding the plans slowly lowered them and looked around. The lake they had been shown in the marketing materials was not there anymore. The perfect reflection of the trees, the calm surface, the image they had used to sell the dream, it was gone. In its place was the exposed lake bed, damp soil, patches of grass, and deep cracks forming where the water had once been. Travis looked at the shoreline, then back at the documents in his hand. Finally, he asked the question everyone knew was coming. "Where's the water?" Nobody answered. One of the engineers walked down carefully into the muddy area, looking for some explanation. He kicked at the ground, checked the measurements, then looked back toward the group. "This isn't what we were promised." And there it was, the sentence that explained everything. Not what we were promised, because the entire deal had been built on a promise from people who had no legal right to make that promise. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called me. She sounded calm, but I could tell from her voice that something significant had happened. She said the developer had suspended the project immediately. Their attorneys had reviewed the documents, and they were now demanding answers from the HOA board. They wanted to know why nobody had verified ownership before signing a development agreement. They wanted to know why a private property owner was never contacted. They wanted to know how a neighborhood association could advertise access to a lake they didn't control. The answer was simple. They assumed they had power, and assumptions are expensive. Within days, the consequences started spreading. The developer filed a claim against the HOA for failing to deliver the promised property access. The amount wasn't some small inconvenience. It was tens of thousands of dollars in penalties, legal expenses, and loss preparation costs. The same board members who had proudly announced the project were now sitting in emergency meetings trying to explain why everything had collapsed. And what made the situation even worse for them was that neighbors started asking questions. Not angry questions at first, confused questions. They wanted to know why they had been told everything was approved. They wanted to know why nobody checked the county records. They wanted to know why the board was so confident when they never had the one thing that mattered most: ownership. Meredith tried to defend herself publicly. She stood in front of the community and said she had only been trying to improve the neighborhood. She said she believed the lake was something everyone should benefit from. And maybe that was the hardest part for me, because I don't think Meredith woke up every morning planning to become the villain of this story. I think she slowly convinced herself that because she was doing what she believed was good for the community, the rules somehow didn't apply to her. But that's how these situations happen. It usually doesn't start with someone saying, "I want to hurt another person." It starts with someone saying, "I know what's best." And once someone believes that, boundaries become obstacles instead of protections. At the next HOA meeting, the mood was completely different. The same room where Meredith once stood confidently talking about the future now felt uncomfortable and quiet. She walked in carrying a folder. But this time, there were no presentations, no smiling faces, no celebration, just questions. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who had lived there for more than 30 years, stood up and asked, "Meredith, why didn't you check the deed?" It was such a simple question, but nobody could answer it, because there wasn't that complicated explanation. There wasn't some hidden legal issue. There wasn't a misunderstanding. They just didn't check. Meredith looked down at the table for a few seconds. For the first time since I had met her, she didn't look powerful. She looked like someone realizing that the authority she believed she had was never as strong as she thought. 2 weeks later, she resigned as HOA president. The new board members reached out to me shortly after that. Their approach was completely different. No demands, no accusations, no attitude. They came to my house, sat down at my kitchen table, and admitted that mistakes were made. They apologized for how I was treated, and I accepted that apology because the truth is, I never wanted revenge. I never wanted my neighbors to suffer. I never wanted anyone to lose money or have their plans ruined. What I wanted was simple. I wanted people to understand that community doesn't mean ownership. Living near something doesn't give you control over it. Having a title doesn't give you permission to take from someone else. By the time summer arrived, the lake started coming back naturally. The spring beneath the ground continued doing what it had done for generations. Slowly, the water returned. The shoreline became green again. The frogs came back at night. Birds returned to the trees. And one morning, I walked down that same old path with my coffee in my hand and looked across the water. For a moment, everything felt exactly like it did before this whole thing started. I thought about my grandfather, about how he built that lake with determination and patience. I thought about how he probably never imagined that decades later, I would have to defend it against people who never bothered to ask if it belonged to them. People still ask me if I think I went too far. They ask if draining the lake was necessary. They ask if there was a better way. And maybe that's the interesting part of this story, because I understand why people have different opinions. Some people believe I should have simply negotiated. Some believe the HOA deserved the consequences because they crossed a clear line. But for me, the answer is simple. I didn't take something away from them. I protected something that was already mine. I didn't destroy their dream. I stopped them from building that dream on someone else's foundation. And now I want to know what you think. If your community association tried to sell or control something that legally belonged to you, would you fight back the same way? Or would you try a different approach? Was this a case of necessary justice, or did things go too far? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, because these stories are never just about land, money, or property lines. They're about trust, respect, and what happens when people forget that authority comes with responsibility. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to share with someone who loves real-life justice stories. Subscribe for more unbelievable moments where ordinary people stand up against unfair situations, and I'll see you in the next story.